Thanks. So we did the triumphal entry, and then last Sunday we did the resurrection, and we talked a little bit about what it was like to come or in hearing the Easter story, and how did that Easter story actually affect us? How do we think about the resurrection in light of our own faith journey, and how often kind of like we looked at Mary Magdalene and her emotions and how she can come, how sometimes we can come face to face with Christ and still maybe not recognize. And so we talked a little bit about the fear that was associated with that, how we can have our own fear, and the vulnerability of acknowledging our own emotions before God, and the things that may hinder us in our own faith journey. Today, we're kind of continuing that story with Thomas and his own doubts. And I think it's another example here in when we're going to kind of piece this together a little bit about when we can be overwhelmed, I think, by confusion, by doubt, by fear, even in our own lives, and how that can sometimes be both a way that we can build our faith, but at the same time, it can also be a way that begins to challenge our faith. And so looking at the different components and how that can happen with all of the emotions that we share. So we're going to dive into today's, again, it's in chapter 20. We're going to be taking the last part of chapter 20 in 19 through 31. And our question really that we're posing here is, where is Christ? Where is the risen Christ in our seasons of doubt, But I want us we're going to read this today, if somebody will volunteer to read it for us. And as we are, notice that there's two accounts of Jesus visiting the disciples. And I want you to pay attention specifically in two things. First of all, I want you to put yourself in the disciples' shoes this morning and think about why they are where they are. Why are they there? And imagine what they may be going through in this moment in time. Now, granted, last week we know that a few of them have heard about the resurrected Christ. They went and they know the tomb was empty. Mary certainly prophesied to that, saying that she'd seen the risen Christ, but they hadn't at this point. And so just imagine what they still may be going through emotionally, the challenges they may have. The second thing I want you to do is, as we're reading it, pay particular attention to the differences in the two versions of Jesus's visitation with the disciples. So look at the two stories. So we'll have one, the first one in the first part of the chapter, and then towards the second, we'll see the second one. But just see where they're similar and where they're different. We're going to compare and contrast those two things this morning. Does anybody want to take those chapter 20, 19 through 31 and read that for us?
I got it.
Thank you very much.
On the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's from the NIV. It seems a little strange to me that Thomas said that. Jesus said, peace be with you. And then he showed all the other disciples his hands. So they got the same benefit Thomas did, for goodness sake.
They sure did. Thank you. Thank you, Warren. That's great.
Because we don't have that benefit
Yeah,
today.
we don't have it. That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Well, let's begin this because you do have this kind of story that John is portraying here for the disciples, these two versions of this. But so where do we find the disciples and what do you think they were going through? What were the emotions, perhaps? What are the feelings you think they were having coming into this piece with John? We know a little bit, but we probably can extrapolate a little bit more. So where do we find them?
Well, they were fearful that they might meet the same fate. They were also afraid that what will we do now that Jesus is gone? They didn't know what direction to take. So they're kind of floating out there, afraid and wondering.
Afraid, wandering.
The church
Certainly.
government was after them, for goodness sakes.
Yeah.
I mean, the organization was out to get them.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that, right? I mean, they just crucified Christ for, unfairly and unjustly in many ways. And so certainly probably also the fear that's surrounding is the same thing that happened to us. You get that from the first part of this in verse 19, where it says they're locked in the house because they're afraid and fearful. What other kind of emotions? I love the thing that Jerry's also said, lost, bewildered. What's next? Where do we go? Everything that you've known at this point, the rug is kind of pulled out from under you, that you're just kind of lost. What else may be going on?
I guess I really kind of, and I don't know why, but I always thought like on Easter Sunday, or Easter, whatever, when Mary ran in and told them she had seen the Lord, I'm realizing now that I always kind of thought, well, they were okay after that, but she was like the only one who saw. You have the two folks from Emmaus, but that they saw, but it sounds like the disciples didn't really believe, and how could you, if you didn't see it yourself? I mean, it sounds insane. So they were still just as lost a week later.
Mm-hmm.
And possibly even after Jesus appeared to them and before he appeared to Thomas, I'm not sure their feelings would have really changed that much. I mean, even after seeing him, we'd still be feeling kind of, because he's leaving you. So, I can't imagine moving on too much from that first appearance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, hold on just a second. So that first appearance, I think it does leave you some doubt in there, right? I think there's some doubt related to what's going on in a particular instance, what's happening, doubt about what's next. I think you're right. I think that it's interesting in reading at least how John portrays it. You really get this idea that Mary Magdalene gets it. She finally comes face to face with Christ, is telling people, even as Tim in his sermon last night was the first one to kind of believe it. But it seems to get an indication here that perhaps the disciples aren't fully believing it yet. They haven't, and I agree with you. I think the reality of it, we talked about this yesterday. You're not expecting somebody to come back. You saw the brutality of this, and in our rational minds, we're not expecting. That's not what life is like. We see people die. When people die, they're dead. I think it's interesting too, in piecing back the story of Lazarus. Jesus goes back to Lazarus before raising Lazarus, and the thing is, he's already gone. He's already gone. In everybody's mind, the finality of that is true. That's what death is like. And so to have this resurrection, I think it goes beyond our sense of reality or even our sensibility. So I think that's also what's so transformative about the message in this. So it's interesting too, why locked away? Why do you think they were locked away? Besides, certainly there's fear, but what else might be going on here that you would lock yourself away? And in one section it says house, in the other section it says, the first it just says locked, the doors are locked. And the second section says house, but why do you think they were locked away?
Oh, it was a safety issue, I think.
I wonder that. Some of it's safety because they were afraid. Why else might you lock yourself away?
Fear and grief, probably. You know, depression. I mean,
I
you
think-
wouldn't want to be around anybody.
Yep, maybe the coming together in that grief is part of it, the coming together, the safety. Think about and I kind of look at it from everything's been out of control of late, right? Everything's been just have gone through this horrific event. And perhaps this is one way also just to create that safety and that control, like to kind of as Jerry said earlier, people were lost. And what happens when we feel lost and afraid and when things seem out of control, we tend to go inward, don't we? We go back into that, so where are we still safe? Where do we feel comfortable? We can do that emotionally. I think in this case, you also see it physically, in a physical sense, that coming together related to that. So you certainly see that. Let's take a look at the two versions here. So let's take a look at the first one. And I guess my questions would be, as we're looking at what Warren read for us in the first, between like 19 to 24 or so, we get this kind of story of Jesus coming into the locked room, or the locked house with the disciples. And so as you're looking at that, a couple of questions I would have is, first of all, what happened in that first version of that? What happened? Who said what and when? And then, kind of what is Jesus? How does Jesus convey himself in that story? So tell me what happens. What happens in this first story here?
I'm kind of extrapolating a little bit. But like in the first one, it said, dead guy shows up and says, peace be with you. And I'm thinking, well, why would he say that? Well, because I'm wondering if they were terrified. Like, here's the dead guy. The proof.
Why did Thomas have to ask to see it? He showed the others, and Thomas had to ask. That's a significant thing. He didn't just automatically show Thomas, who had not been there.
I had a note in my Bible, and it said that when he said, peace be with you, he was trying to relieve their anxiety, but also let them know that he wasn't going to come to scold them because they had run away and deserted him. So
Right.
to let them know that, it was okay. It was okay.
And also, peace be with you was a common greeting during Jesus' time, shalom. And that's a very powerful greeting. If you read throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus has a whole lot to say about peace. The other thing about this first appearance, Thomas wasn't there. He was not there, and I think that's the problem. I thought the commentary did a very good job in depicting a realistic picture of Thomas. We refer to Thomas as Doubting Thomas, and sure, he had his doubts, but also he was the absentee Thomas. He wasn't there with a group of believers the first time that Jesus showed himself. And when they told Thomas, hey, we've seen the Lord, he said, well, I just can't believe. I'm not going to believe unless I see the wounds in his hands and his side. So Thomas was absent that first appearance.
Well, and Thomas pretty much did the same thing all the others had done, because even though Mary had already told them she had seen the Lord, none of them believed, So I think maybe he wanted the same experience that they had too.
Mhm.
And also in this first appearance, after Jesus says, "Peace be with you," he says, "As the Father sent me, so I send you." He was commissioning them continue the ministry that that Jesus has started. And then also the next verse 22, says that he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." So he was giving them spiritual life and spiritual strength to face what they had to face. And I think that's something that's significant to this first appearance.
Mhm. Too. But let's compare then this. So Henry, you pointed out several things. I think this first appearance is, so let's just summarize that. First of all, Jesus appears to them in the locked room. He starts off he's the one that starts off the conversation saying, "Peace be with you." He then shows the disciples his hands and his side. You hear the disciples are overjoyed by this. And again, Jesus speaks to them, "Peace be with you," and then breathes on them the Holy Spirit and commissions them, all in that stage. Notice that in John's version of this, in this first thing, that it's mostly Jesus doing the talking. You don't have John coming back saying that the disciples say anything in response, other than they respond in kindness. Now, the other thing, notice what I think it's significant in a couple of ways, is that Jesus twice tells them, "Peace be with them." I think one, and especially the one after the kind of the commissioning, if you will. And what is the commissioning that he gives them, particularly in this one? I thought that was interesting too, considering. What's the commissioning that he gives in?
We're talking about forgiving the sins
Yeah,
that they are forgiven, and that they decide not to. And the sins are still there.
right. So peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I will send you. And then he goes on, and when he had said this, he breathed it. But there was this idea about the forgiveness. Why do you think he said something about the forgiveness there?
He's making judges out of them. He can judge people now.
Mm-hmm.
And that
So
seems a little.
I thought it was interesting we went with forgiveness versus peace or wholeness, in that. I just thought it was an interesting choice, and I'm just kind of curious what other thoughts were that.
I don't think that the disciples can forgive sins in the way that God can. It's my interpretation of this is that they're supposed to go out and proclaim God's message, and then if people accept that message, they're forgiven by God, and if they do not accept it, then they're not forgiven. I think that's what that means. I think only God can forgive sin.
Other thoughts on that forgiveness idea?
I mean, we can forgive somebody personally. I mean, if somebody wrongs you or something,
Right.
I absolutely forgive.
Yeah.
But you can't. But you can't forgive them for God.
Mm-hmm. Henry, you're muted. That's like your mouth moving.
Yeah, I had to go make some coffee, and I didn't want y'all to hear my coffee maker running. So, I think Carl is right on target with what he said, because no man can forgive another man's sin. That's something that's up to God. However, I think John is writing to the community here, and the community plays a huge role when it comes to forgiving and retaining over in Matthew, the words were used, binding and loosing, but here, forgiving and retaining. And I think it's the responsibility of the church to proclaim forgiveness. And I think this is what Jesus had in mind. And I think what John had in mind when he was writing this, that it's the church that has the privilege to announce God's forgiveness. And then again, we all know that it's only God can forgive. Now, in respect to the Roman Catholic Church, they kind of take this literally and apply it to confession and penance. And I really don't have a problem with that. I think going into the confessional and talking with the priest and confessing, and even some penance can be therapeutic. I think it can be therapeutic for Christians. Now that doesn't sound very Baptist, but we do the same thing. We may go to the pastor and sit down and talk to the pastor about issues that we're dealing with. We don't go into a confessional and have sacrament of confession, but this idea of confessing and forgiving, and the church having the power to announce God's forgiveness, I think is really, really powerful.
I agree. I wonder too, if there's a little bit, Jesus has just imparted the Holy Spirit on them. And so they've been empowering them to send them out. I wonder, not only is this to me, a discommissioning to go and share God's forgiveness and love, I wonder if this is also an important message for them to hear in light of everything they have just been through. I mean, you just had Jesus twice repeat, peace with you. And this is another kind of an affirmation. I'm empowering you with the Holy Spirit. I am going to be with you. And I think there's some comfort in the fact of realizing that Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, remains even in light of all probably the shame and the guilt that they've experienced coming up to the crucifixion. And that may be a stretch, but I choose to believe that that's also part of what's underneath this. I'm just curious if others think the same thing.
Yeah, I thought that too. Like, they had abandoned him. And so hearing that message, like, Jesus didn't hold a grudge against them. He had forgiven them and still love them. And so, yeah.
I mean, it'd be really hard to carry the message if that wasn't true, right? If you were still carrying that shame and that guilt from that, you had to be freed from that. And I wonder if part of this is experiencing that freedom that comes from Christ in this moment. How much freer then are you able then to take that burden off and know that I can go share this gospel message? This is what it means to live. In verse 31, which we'll get to, is this is what it means to live in the life of Christ. Is this? How can I get that freedom unless I'm forgiven?
Warren.
Warren.
Aren't there some contradictions here? When John was written so much later than the other gospels, and Luke and Acts tell us that they received the Holy Spirit in front of the big crowd there. And so John's interpretation seems different from the others. I don't know how much he looked at the other writings, but it seems to me there's some sort of contradiction going on.
With the coming of the Spirit. Yeah, I thought that too when I was looking at this.
Oh, the Bible doesn't contradict itself, does it? The inspired, literal, living word, right?
There are apparent contradictions that folks need to think about, though, I think.
Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely.
I kind of wondered, he says, peace be with you twice, and then he gives them the power to forgive. I mean, I can't help but think about me in that situation. I mean, I'm sure there had to be a ton of anger with the disciples as well. You know, these people have just murdered Jesus in front of you, and you know, to be given the power to forgive or not forgive at that moment, I sure wouldn't be forgiving anybody that had a hand in what happened to Jesus. So, you know, maybe he had to offer them his peace so that they could let go of that anger and forgive as well.
Rusty, there's something else in this that I don't know if it's a new thought or if it's just an old thought that came back to mind. I don't know, but Thomas was present with them the second time Jesus appeared, but Thomas was not a believer. He did not believe at that time, didn't believe that Jesus was resurrected. But even though Thomas did not believe, he was not excluded from the fellowship. He was still accepted by the fellowship of the disciples. And I think that's important. You know, they were able to embrace Thomas and Thomas's doubts. And still Thomas was accepted into the disciples' fellowship.
Good point. Let's look at the next story, right? Or right following it. So, or at least Jesus' second visitation, as John presents it with the disciples again in the locked room. So let's look at what's different, what's similar, and what's different of the second version, beginning in I think it begins at verse 24, 26, when Jesus again comes back to disciples. Is about a week later, is how John writes it, is what it sounds like. And you had in between this where Thomas is saying, you know, I'm not going to believe unless I see it. And so he wasn't there. Now he is here. So how do the stories compare and contrast?
Well, I think, you know, that part of it is that Thomas, you know, he voices his doubt, and perhaps they had the same. And that's the reason Jesus went ahead and showed them his hands and his side.
Mm-hmm.
And Thomas is just very straightforward and very open about it. And I think that's one difference.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't, you know, they were just keeping their mouths shut. But he said, no, I've got to see this for myself.
In that first verse, you don't get much interplay between the
No,
disciples and
no,
Jesus.
no.
In the second one, you see this dialogue going between
Right.
the two. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. What else do you see different in this one?
Well, Thomas immediately says, my Lord and my God. You know, he makes that pronouncement of faith that the others, you know, maybe he had a week to mull over that the others had seen Jesus. You know, I guess maybe the first appearance, they were too stunned to say anything, but he's had a week to, even though he said what he did, he's had a week to ponder that they have all had this experience. So maybe he's a little closer to believing than they were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Seems to me this is a commission to us at the very end of this, that we are to believe without seeing.
Yeah, definitely. What's missing in this version that was in the first version? What's missing in this one?
He doesn't give Thomas that same commission, perhaps.
That it's a different commission, isn't it? It's not the same one that he gave the disciples before. There's also something else I think that's interesting that's missing in this second visitation.
He doesn't say peace be with you when he leaves.
That, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't breathe on Thomas.
He doesn't breathe on Thomas. I thought that was so. It almost, I wonder in some of this too is, you know, the imparting of the Holy Spirit has already happened. I think it had already touched Thomas at this point. So is that one reason why it's not mentioned again? I think that this interaction is a very distinct interaction versus the first one with between Jesus and a specific disciple, in this case, Thomas. Again, the peace be with you is stated this time, though. Jesus specifically talks to Thomas and said, put your finger here, see my hands reach out your hand and put it into my side, stop doubting and believe. You know, and so it seems very physical, and it doesn't seem that way in the early one. In the early one is that this invitation to touch me physically into this, to touch and to believe, is pretty, but it's one in which Thomas, I think, needs in this. I think you see that in the earlier parts of the verse. And it does give him that stereotype, I think, of doubting Thomas into this: until I touch it, I'm not going to believe. And I like Henry, I agree with you. I love how the commentary then really breaks and tells you a little bit more about who Thomas was and brings back in the earlier verses, which we can look at. But I think it's interesting. And I think to Carl Warren's point, you know, that where Jesus then says, after Thomas's declaration, I mean, think how emphatic he is. As soon as he touches Christ, he says, "My Lord and my God." He's in all in at that very moment, right? It's almost as if Mary, when she finally, when the veil comes off of her eyes, when he speaks to her and realizes you are the risen Christ, those veil come in, and she is all in. And it's this transformation, I think, that's pretty miraculous. But it also begins to point to us, I think, that each of us, right, each individual, that transformation, that opening, that awareness of Christ within our lives into that, right, can happen to us in different ways. And it may take different ways and different experiences for us to come closer to, I think, the risen Christ and what that means in our own faith journey. And I think this is a good example of it. But the commissioning to us, as Warren pointed out, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, who have not seen and have believed. What other things, does that resonate with you? I thought those are interesting differences in how John is conveying it. I go back to that light and darkness idea of John throughout the Gospel of John, where he talks often about this. In some ways, you can almost take that light where people are in darkness and suddenly they're in light. Here's Thomas in darkness, not believing in the resurrection, the risen Christ, and suddenly he is my Lord, my God, after seeing it. Mary Magdalene the same way. The disciples in the locked room, those I think are all interesting, again, allusion to how John writes the gospel, that can talk about this in some ways, when sight happens in a way, from moving from our darkness to light.
I think the word doubt gets unjust black eye often. When we think of doubt as calling something into question, there's different ways to experience doubt. I guess if we're going to be cynical and let our doubts just camouflage a belief, and we don't want that doubt that's creeping up to challenge us to pursue the truth, that can be bad. But if the doubt is constructive and we are willing to look at things objectively, to search for the truth and why we're having that doubt, that it can be very productive. And it may not be instantaneous. It may take a period of time, but that intuition that we have is there for a reason, and we should not just discard it. C.S. Lewis said in Weight of the Glory that success in searching for the truth comes through diligence in what we're doing, and that there's never a really great time, opportune time to search for the truth. In fact, if we wait for the right time to search for the truth, we'll never find it. So, I think that he says very well what our curiosities and are there for a good reason, not necessarily that we should have just blind allegiance to things in this world. So I can relate to Thomas, and I would suspect that there were some other disciples and people that were Jesus's followers that they may not have said it, but they thought it, what Thomas said.
Mhm.
Thank you, Mitch. You just gotta summarize the rest of the lesson.
Yeah. What,
With
what,
C.D.
what,
Lewis.
what Mitch said reminded me of a book that was written some years ago when we studied it in seminary. And don't remember a whole lot about it, but I remember I was really influenced by it. And don't have a copy of it now, but the name of the book was The Christian Agnostic, and it was written by Leslie Weatherhead, who was minister and theologian in London, England. I suppose he was either Methodist or Church of England. I don't remember which one, but in that book, Weatherhead left a lot of room for doubt, and that doubt is a way that can lead us to truth. And then again, doubt may not lead us anywhere. We may just stay right where we are in our doubt. But he said it. Now, his book was controversial, to say the least. He said, yes, you can be a Christian and you can be an agnostic, also the Christian agnostic. You can live the Christian life without believing all the layers and layers and layers of theology and doctrine that the church has laid over Jesus Christ. And that was basically what he was saying. A couple of things about Thomas came to my mind. One is that Thomas refused to say that he believed when he did not believe. There was an honesty about Thomas, and I like that about him. But then when he was sure, he went the whole way. There was no halfway house for Thomas. When he saw Jesus, and I've always wondered, did he touch Jesus? Did he actually reach out and touch him, or presumably he didn't? I don't know, but he refused to believe when he did not believe, but when he was sure, when he was convinced, he went the whole way and said, "My Lord and my God."
Thank you for that, for both of y'all. I think it's great. Jeff?
Yeah, I like what the commentary said. Don't believe anything on the basis of rumor or hearsay. And then it goes on to say there's a fine line between fraud and faith, and Thomas can help us remember that. So I had grown up in my tradition hearing about Thomas, like he was like, oh, the doubting Thomas narrative. And I had never really thought of the text, like he did get a really bad rap. But I think he was being really thoughtful, and he wanted to make sure that what he was buying into was the truth. And I think that says a lot about where we are today, that just because somebody gets up and tells us, well, this is what you should believe, we can look at how some of that has gone really bad. And so we need to work it out ourselves and make sure what we're believing is truth, if there is such a thing. But the other commentary, I read another commentary. It was talking about if you replace belief with trust, that it was more of a, was Jesus really asking them to believe, or was he asking them to trust him? So the trust part being more of a relational kind of aspect between them and Jesus. So that was just something else I thought was interesting.
I think the way the commentary really portrays and points out a couple of things with Thomas, he's kind of friend you kind of want on your back pocket, right? He certainly has some shortfalls in some of the things, but just the fact, going back to John 11 and also John 14, where in John 11, when Jesus is debating whether or not to go back to Lazarus because he knows Lazarus is sick, and the disciples are really trying to encourage Jesus not to go because they're fearful of his life. And it is Thomas then who says, he goes, okay, if you're gonna go and you're adamant about going, we're all gonna go and we're all gonna die together. In other words, he's kind of like, we're gonna do it, I'm gonna have your back, and I think it's a wonderful statement on who he is. And again, being, I think in the same way, he's pretty consistent about being very honest and true in who he is. And even concerning 14, when Jesus is talking about needing to go, he's going to go away. And it is Thomas who comes back and says, yeah, we don't have an idea what you're talking about, and I love that, the honesty again. But just think how courageous that is to be the one person out of whoever that is able to stand up and say, I really don't understand what you're saying. And that's a pretty courageous moment to be in. And we probably all have been in situations like that where you're surrounded by people and everybody else seems to be getting it. You're just sitting there going, I have not a clue what y'all are talking about right now. It's like we slow down a minute because I don't get it. And so I think, but just think how, even in those situations, how courageous that has to, the amount of energy that takes to put forth and say, hey guys, slow down, I don't quite understand. Or to put your life on the line and said, I believe in you so much that I'm willing to put my life on the line because I know this is important to you, to go forth. And I see that again here is a continuation of that. I think, and Mitch, you were hitting on this a little bit. I think in our vulnerability before God, I think we can really grow in our faith when we doubt, when we acknowledge our fears, when we acknowledge our confusion, and we're bringing those before God, but we're also sitting back and prayerfully asking, how do I process through those fears and being honest in that truthfulness before God. I think that the danger can come in on all of our emotions is when they suddenly stop us from growing, right? When our doubts stop us from actually going deeper, as you were saying, Mitch. If you are a doubter and you become a cynic, and then in that cynicism, we're looking at everything from that cynical point of view that we never actually use it as a way to grow deeper. And I think that's where, or when we allow fear to basically control us, that we no longer can move forward, so we're so afraid and letting go. And I think this where, to me, the verse that keeps on coming back to me that over these last few weeks is, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but acknowledging God's ways. And I think this is to me what I keep on coming back in my own summary of these things is so often in my doubts, I want to hold on to my understanding of things. In my own fears, I'm trying to hold on to those fears because it makes me feel better. I want to hold on to my image of Jesus. I don't want to change that, but it's really the transformation in our own weakness that I think that where Christ can meet us and we can be transformed. And I think part of that is that ongoing transformation which comes, I think, through a life of faith with the risen Lord. So those are how I kind of bring that around. What do y'all think? Closing comments, thoughts about doubting Thomas?
Well, one more quote from the commentary. I just thought
Okay.
the commentary did a really good job. In short, what if our doubts are not the devil's doing, pulling us away from truth, but God's doing, drawing us to it? What if doubt is one of the surprising tools God uses to lead us to a better faith? So you kind of said that about being a cynic, Mitch. And so it pulls us to be better people.
One of the thing that I really love about this is, to me, that this is an example of Jesus's love, because basically the second story is just almost the same as the first. The main difference is that Jesus came, I think, to actually show Thomas, and that was his demonstrating his love for Thomas. And I think, I don't know, I can kind of relate to that. I mean, all the other disciples got to see Jesus, and for whatever reason, Thomas was not there then. And I think that I can understand him feeling like, why don't y'all all see Jesus and me not, and particularly going back to the verses earlier that you said, Rusty. And so I love that Jesus came back to show Thomas, think that's really, I think that just demonstrates Jesus's love.
I know this is a little off, but it said one thing that struck me in the text, it's saying Jesus did all these other miracles. And I'm like, well, why didn't you tell us, John? Come on. Like, why did he not,
Come on.
like, what did he do? I'm like, what other things did he do? I don't know. It just piqued my curiosity, like why that wasn't included.
He was setting it up for his next book. So, you know, he's like trying to cook you so you'll buy the next book.
Is it like a sequel?
That's right.
Part two,
Aaron,
John?
were you about to say something?
Another thing I thought was interesting too is because this, you know, seems to demonstrate love and Jesus coming in peace and everything.
Yeah.
We're talking about the inconsistencies in the Bible, because the one in Mark at the end, it basically says Jesus came and scolded them all. But that's in those verses where it talks about, you know, drinking poison and poisonous snakes that were not in the original manuscript. And
Yeah.
because that, it just doesn't seem to me that that verse demonstrates Jesus's characteristics.
Yeah.
The other thing that Russ, right there at the end of verse 31, and I've not even thought about this before, the different manuscripts, I'm not sure what version this is in the text here, but it says that you may come to believe. And in this, I think this is the NIV, it said may believe. And then a footnote said that some manuscripts say continue, that you may continue to believe. So that's three, you know, that's semantics,
Yeah.
I guess you could say there, but that's three different things. They have essentially three different meanings.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all for today. So many blessings to you, and may we bring our doubts before God. And in that bringing our doubts, maybe grow closer to the Lord who loves and saves us. Amen. Y'all have a wonderful day, and I will look forward to seeing you worship here in a few minutes. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Well, Lord, we're so glad.